So with the enterprise portion, just as we touched on it in terms of the actual definition. So an enterprise can either exclude certain things, transactions, or business formats, or it can also include certain things or business formats. So it's basically dependent on the situation at hand. So what can an enterprise include? So an enterprise can also include termination of an enterprise. That in itself can also be an enterprise. Why? Because when we terminate an enterprise that would have been an enterprise, that would mean that the VAT consequences that arise as an activity or as an act that would have arisen because there would have been termination of one such enterprise, which would have likely been a VAT vendor having charged input VAT and output VAT. So we will basically touch base in terms of termination of such activities that would likely come in the form of ceasing to be a vendor. So you have to be very mindful of what termination would likely entail. And it will also likely be a public benefit organization, which is basically a vendor, because indeed, yes, PBOs can also register if they so wish. It depends on the actual character of that particular PBO. So indeed, most PBOs are not registered VAT vendors, but in certain instances, they can also register. It's not like, a given that they'd likely not be registered. They can also register. So if they're registered and you somehow transact with a PBO, then in that particular situation, it can also be an enterprise, as taken into consideration like the definition as we basically touched on it in our prior slides. So there are different situations that can give rise to an enterprise. Commencement of a business as well, that also can be an enterprise. But it specifically excludes certain activities that could be a transaction between an employer and an employee, basically. Employer and an employee transaction in the form of where an employer, in this instance, pays an employee a salary or wages. Why would such be an exclusion? This would be an exclusion because salaries and wages are basically, it's like a transfer of money. There are no two parties that are basically transacting with each other. So this is a transfer of money. And basically meaning that there's no two parties transacting with each other. So the employee is paying, his employee in this particular instance. So why would salaries and wages not be included within the definition of an enterprise or within being taxable in nature? That would be because salaries and wages are not taxable in nature because they are not included within the definition of an enterprise. It's not an enterprise. That's how you get around it in a certain situation where you have to deal with a test situation that would maybe give you such a situation as well. And it definitely also, as we touched on, does not include a hobby. In our prior example, we used a situation where you're a designer who happens to be very talented, but however, you are a very good designer. You design these beautiful garments and you happen to supply these at a consideration to your friends or whoever would be, and you happen to have sold the dress for 1.5 million rands to one of your friends for their wedding, and it was a once-off transaction because you basically don't do that too often, so it definitely doesn't happen too regularly or daily. So it's something that you do sometimes. You do have your core business, which you spend much of your time in. So in that regard, that would basically mean to say that you are not an enterprise. You are not an enterprise, even if you've basically exceeded the threshold amount of 1 million rands that would deem you to be compulsory registering for being a VAT vendor, because you do not qualify, you do not do this on a regular basis. It's not your core business, you know. So as such, you are not an enterprise in that regard. So such a transaction would not be deemed to be an enterprise. You know, therefore there would not be any VAT, you know, consequences that arise as a result of such. So just keep that whole portion of the enterprise that has to be married with that beautiful definition that we basically open up our discussion on, in terms of the two being in harmony with each other. So be very mindful of these unique features that would likely be prevalent when you're dealing with certain given situations. So that's basically where we are, just as we close in this chapter, or rather a topic in this session that we've termed the enterprise part. All right then.